The thermal bolt struck Elias Thorne square in the chest, the kinetic impact throwing his lean frame back against the scorched hull of Icarus. In the sterile, predatory silence of the docking bay, the sound of the impact was sickening, a wet, heavy thud that signaled the end of a biological life. Commander Craft of the Xylosian Hegemony lowered his pulse caster, his mandibles twitching in a rhythmic display of dismissal. To the Xylosians, humans were Gauze-Walkers, creatures of porous bone and thin skin who required pressurized suits and filtered atmospheres just to exist in a galaxy that was inherently hostile to them. Biological waste neutralized. Craft clicked over the comms, his voice a series of grating metallic chirps. Secure the data core. The fragile one is dead. But Elias Thorne did not stay down. The smoke cleared, revealing a blackened hole in the center of his flight jacket. The fabric was charred, and the skin beneath was blistered and weeping. He slumped against the bulkhead, his head bowed, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. Then a sound emerged. It wasn't a death rattle. It wasn't a plea for mercy. It was a laugh. It started as a low, bubbling wheeze in his throat and climbed into a jagged, hysterical bark that echoed off the cold titanium walls. Elias looked up, his face smeared with soot and blood, eyes wide and shimmering with an unsettling, frantic light. He wasn't looking at his wound. He was looking at Craft. That's it. Elias rasped, his voice tearing through the silence. You've been hunting us across 3 sectors, calling us fragile, and that's the best your Godslayer rifle can do? Craft froze. His secondary ocular sensors recalibrated, zooming in on the human's chest. The bolt had melted through the sternum. By every law of Xylosian biology, the human's nervous system should have shut down from sheer agony. Yet, Thorne was gripping the edge of a jagged hull plate. Pulling himself to his feet. Stay down, Gauze-Walker. Craft hissed, a flicker of something unknown, perhaps the Xylosian equivalent of dread, touching his neural net. Your heart is failing. Your adrenaline is a temporary chemical lie. Maybe, Elias grinned, and the sight of red-stained teeth made the soldiers behind Craft recoil. But the thing about being fragile is, we spent our whole history learning how to fix what breaks. And the things we can't fix, we just learn to live with the pain until it feels like fuel. The air in the docking bay felt heavy, charged with the smell of ozone and copper. For the Xylosians, who evolved with internal cartilaginous plates and regenerative numbing agents, the concept of enduring pain was an evolutionary oversight. To them, pain was a binary switch. It meant off. Elias took a step forward. His boots crunched on the shattered glass of the observation deck. He looked small, a solitary bipedal primate standing against 6-foot-tall, insectoid warriors encased in powered exoskeletons. I watched you load the colony at New Hera, Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a terrifying focus. I watched you lift our transport ships with your gravity tethers and drop them like toys. You think you're strong because your toys are big. He reached out, his hand trembling, not from fear, but from a massive neurological overload of his injuries, and gripped the underside of a crash-type for a shuttle that had been wedged into the bay doors. The shuttle was a 3-ton hunk of dense alloy, its engines dead, its stabilizers locked. It had taken a Xylosian recovery crane to move it there. What are you doing? Craft demanded, raising his caster again. And this madness. I'm showing you the difference between power and will, Elias growled, his muscles corded. The veins in his neck stood out like whipcords, and a fresh spray of blood leaked from his chest wound as the strain tore at his damaged tissues. A human's physical limits are governed by the brain to prevent the body from shattering its own bones. In this moment, Elias Thorne simply turned those limiters off. With a primal, guttural roar that sounded more like a shifting tectonic plate than a human voice, Elias lifted. The metal groaned. The hydraulic seals hissed in protest. The Xylosians watched in stunned, motionless silence as the 3-ton shuttle shifted. Slowly, impossibly, the nose of the craft rose. Elias's feet cracked the floor plating beneath him. His face turned a deep, bruised purple. With a final, violent heave, Elias didn't just lift the shuttle. He shoved it. The massive craft slid 3 meters back. clearing the bay door and slamming into the far wall with a deafening crash that shook the entire station. Elias stood in the newly cleared space, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a terrifying defiance. He didn't fall. He stayed upright, a broken, bleeding monument to sheer stubbornness. "We're fragile," Elias spat, a thick glob of blood hitting the floor. "But we're the only things in this galaxy that don't know when to stay dead." Kvath's sensors were screaming. His HUD flashed red, threat level, undetermined. Biological anomalies detected. He looked at his elite squad, warriors who had conquered a dozen worlds, and saw them backing away. They weren't looking at a soldier. They were looking at a ghost that refused to leave the shell. Why do you laugh?" Kvath asked, his voice nearly a whisper. Elias leaned his head back against the cold metal, a faint, ghost-like smile touching his lips. "Because I just realized something, Kvath. You're not afraid of our ships. You're not even afraid of our guns." He stepped toward the alien leader, ignoring the 3 pulsecasters aimed at his head. "You're afraid because you realize that if a fragile thing can do this, you have no idea what we're actually capable of when we stop being nice." Elias's eyes suddenly rolled back, and he collapsed, not with a whimper, but with the heavy, solid sound of a fallen tree. Kvath didn't move to secure the prisoner. He didn't order his men to fire. He stood over the unconscious human, watching the shallow rise and fall of that damaged chest. For the first time in the history of the hegemony, a Xylosian commander felt the cold, creeping sensation of a predator realizing it had walked into a trap. The human had lifted a shuttle. He had laughed at a lethal wound. Kvath looked at the data core in the corner of the room, then back at Elias. If this was what one dying human could do, what happened when the rest of them found out how their fragility was being tested? Far above them, in the silent dark of the system's edge, the long-range sensors of the Xylosian fleet picked up a new signal. It wasn't a distress call. It was a high-frequency broadcast on all channels, originating from human survivors on the surface. It was a single, repeating sound. Laughter. The medical bay of the Xylosian flagship, the Weaver's Needle, smelled of ozone and synthetic preservative. Commander Kvath stood behind a reinforced transparency pylon, his 4 eyes fixed on the specimen, Elias Thorne. The human was suspended in a stasis field. Ribbons of green light danced across his pale skin, mapping the internal carnage. To Kvath's chief biologist, a spindly creature named Zul with elongated tactile sensors, the readings were a mathematical insult. He should be a corpse. Zul clicked, his sensors twitching over a holographic display of Elias' skeletal structure. The thermal bolt caused third-degree vaporization of the dermal layers. The shock wave induced hairline fractures in the clavicle and sternum. Furthermore, the act of lifting that shuttle caused his own muscular fibers to detach from the bone in 6 places. He literally tore himself apart to move that weight. And yet, Kvath hissed his mandibles tight, he breathed. He laughed. Why did he laugh, Zul? Analysis suggests a surge of dopamine and endorphins, a biological overclocking unique to their species when faced with certain death. Zul replied, projecting a graph of the human's brain activity during the event. In most sentient life, pain is a deterrent. In humans, under extreme duress, it becomes a catalyst. They don't just endure it, they weaponize it. Kvath felt a cold ripple through his primary nervous system. The hegemony had spent centuries categorizing the galaxy. There were the hardshells, warrior races with natural armor, the gas drifters, ethereal thinkers, and the Gauze-Walkers, fragile, soft-body builders. Humans have been firmly placed in the third category, useful for labor or art, but easily crushed. But the data on the screen suggested something horrifying. Humans weren't fragile because of lack of strength. They were fragile because they were built like high-performance engines running without a governor. Their very biology was a state of controlled explosion. Can he be interrogated? Kvath asked. He is awake, Zul said, his voice dropping an octave. He has been awake for 20 centicycles. He refused the numbing agents. He is watching us. Kvath stepped around the pylon. Inside the stasis field, Elias Thorne's eyes were indeed open. They were bloodshot, the white stained pink by burst capillaries. But the pupils were sharp. He wasn't thrashing. He was sitting on the edge of the biopod, the stasis field humming as it struggled to keep his failing organs stable. "Commander," Elias croaked. His voice was erect, but the mocking edge remained. "Nice ship, a bit sterile for my taste. Needs a rug, maybe some bloodstains to match the decor. You are a prisoner of the hegemony, Thorne," Kraft projected, his translator translating his clicks into a booming, synthesized bass. "Explain the mechanism of your resilience. You are a biological anomaly. Did your colony use illegal gene editing? Are you a kinetic-enhanced cyborg?" Elias looked down at his bandaged chest, then back at Kraft. He let out a dry, rattling chuckle. "No chrome, Commander. No edits. Just millions of years of being the slowest, weakest thing on a planet full of monsters. We didn't have claws, so we made spears. We didn't have shells, so we learned how to hide. And when we couldn't hide..." Elias leaned forward, the stasis field crackling as his movement disrupted the frequency. "We learned that if you're going to be broken, you make sure the thing breaking you loses a finger in the process." "Illogical," Kraft snapped. "Sacrificing the self for a minor injury to the opponent is evolutionary suicide." "That's why you're losing," Elias said simply. The silence that followed was heavy. Kraft wanted to scoff, but he remembered the docking bay. He remembered his elite soldiers, veterans of the Jovian Wars, flinching when a dying man moved a shuttle. "We are not losing," Kraft said, though he thought of the reports from the front lines. The human resistance wasn't using advanced tactics. They were using suicide maneuvers that no Xylosian would ever dream of. They were ramming ships when their guns ran dry. They were holding grenades in their teeth. "You're scared," Elias whispered. It wasn't a taunt. It was an observation. "You look at us and you see something that doesn't follow the rules. You thought we were gauze. You didn't realize that gauze is what you use to wrap a wound before you go back into fight." Kraft turned to Zool. "Prepare the neural probe. If he will not speak of their will, we will extract the blueprints of their psychological conditioning. I want to know how to break the laughter." Zool hesitated. "Commander, the human's cortical activity is erratic. A neural probe might trigger a total systemic collapse." "Do it," Kraft commanded. "If he dies, we dissect the brain. One way or another, I will understand why he didn't stay down." As Zool approached with the probe, a terrifying crown of crystalline needles, Elias didn't flinch. He didn't plead. He simply watched the needles descend, his eyes reflecting the shimmering light of the Xylosian technology. "You know what's funny, Kraft?" Elias said, his voice eerily calm as the needles touched his temples. "Nothing about this is humorous, human." "The laughter," Elias said, his grin widening even as his body began to seize from the neural interface. "It's not a joke. It's a countdown. Every time a human laughs in the face of a god, it means a god just ran out of time." The needles pierced. Elias's back arched, his mouth opening in a silent scream that quickly transitioned into that same, terrifying, jagged laugh. Suddenly, the lights in the medbay flickered. The flagship sirens began to wail. Not a medical alert, but a combat alarm. "Commander!" A voice crackled over the ship-wide comms. "Two human stealth frigates just decloaked inside our defensive perimeter. They aren't firing weapons." "Then what are they doing?" Kraft roared. They are accelerating, Commander. They've overridden their reactor safeties. They're using their ships as kinetic slugs. They're aiming for the engine clusters." Kraft looked at Elias. The human was shaking, the neural probe feeding him the ship's own data streams as it tried to map his mind. Through the pain, through the white-hot agony of the probe, Elias was smiling at him. "See!" Elias gasped, blood leaking from beneath the needles. "Fragile, just like a glass shard. You step on us and you bleed to death." Kraft watched as the first impact shuddered through the Weaver's needle. The humans weren't coming to rescue Thorne. They were coming to destroy the ship that held him, regardless of the cost. They were proving his point. The commander realized then that he hadn't captured a prisoner. He had invited a virus onto his bridge, and infection was a philosophy that the hegemony was never built to survive. "Get us out of here," Kraft ordered, his voice trembling. "Initiate warp jump. Now." "We can't." Zool screamed over the alarms. The human, his neural signature is, he's fighting the probe, he's flooding the ship's subroutine with his own biorhythms. He's locking the navigation computer. Elias Thorne's laughter drowned out the sirens, a wild, beautiful, and terrifying sound that promised a future where Fragile would inherit the stars by burning everything else to the ground. The Weaver's needle groaned, a sound like a dying leviathan. The kinetic impact of the human frigates had buckled the secondary stabilizers, but it was the internal assault that was truly crippling the flagship. In the medical bay, the air was thick with the scent of scorched insulation and copper. Elias Thorne was no longer just a man in a stasis field. He was a lightning rod. The neural probe, designed to extract memories from compliant or broken minds, had become a two-way conduit. The Xylosian technology, built on a logic of rigid, crystalline pulses, was being flooded by the chaotic, symphonic noise of a human nervous system in total rebellion. Disconnect him. Kvath roared, his mandibles snapping in panic as the floor tilted beneath his feet. He is backfeeding the system. Zool scrambled at the console, his multiple limbs blurring. I cannot. The interface has fused. His synaptic firing rate is... It's impossible. He's generating a localized EMP through the neural link. He isn't just resisting the probe. Commander, he's colonizing it. On the holographic displays, the ship's schematic was turning a violent, pulsing red. The human's heart rate, displayed in a jagged line, was mirroring the ship's reactor fluctuations. Elias's body was a wreck, his skin was pale, his muscles twitching in rhythmic spasms, but his mind was a wildfire. Elias's eyes snapped open. They weren't bloodshot anymore. They were void black, the pupils blown wide as he stared through the ceiling, through the hull, into the very heart of the Xylosian network. I can see you, Elias whispered. The ship's speakers picked up his voice, broadcasting it across every deck. It wasn't the voice of a dying man. It was layered, distorted, vibrating with the power of the ship's own subprocessors. I can see the way you think in straight lines. So cold, so fragile. Seal the bay. Kvath commanded his guards. Terminate the specimen. Physical termination now. The two Xylosian warriors stepped forward, their heavy carapace suits clanking. They raised their thermal lances, the tips glowing with the heat of a miniature sun. Elias didn't move. He didn't have to. As the guards squeezed their triggers, the overhead gravity plates reversed. The two 600-pound warriors were slammed into the ceiling with a bone-crunching crack. Their lances fired wildly, melting holes in the reinforced deck plating. The gravity! He's controlling the gravity? Zool shrieked, cowering behind his terminal. No! Elias's voice boomed through the speakers, accompanied by a distorted, electronic chuckle. I'm just laughing, and the ship is laughing with me. Outside the viewport, the two human suicide frigates had stopped their approach. They hung in the void like vultures, their engines glowing a dim, menacing orange. They weren't attacking anymore because they didn't need to. They were waiting for the signal. Kvath grabbed a manual override blade from the wall, a physical backup for a digital age, and lunged toward the neural probe's power conduit. He was a warrior of 1,000 campaigns, a scion of a race that ruled through superior biology and flawless logic. He would not be undone by a biological fluke. You are nothing, Kvath hissed, plunging the blade into the glowing cable. You are a spark in a vacuum. You will flicker out and be forgotten. The feedback hit Kvath like a physical blow. A surge of raw, unedited human emotion, grief, rage, love, and a terrifying, bone-deep stubbornness poured through the blade and into his nervous system. For a heartbeat, Kvath didn't see the medical bay. He saw a blue planet under siege. He felt the warmth of a sun he'd never known. He felt the crushing weight of 1,000 years of human struggle. The fragility that drove them to build cathedrals out of stone and rockets out of tinfoil. He saw why they laughed. It was the only rational response to a universe that tried so hard to kill them and failed. Kvath fell back, his mandibles leaking clear fluid, his primary ocular sensors clouded. The cable was severed, but the link didn't break. Elias Thorne slumped forward, the crystalline needles sliding out of his temples with a sickening hiss. He felt the floor, his breathing shallow, His body finally spent. The lights on the ship died. The humming of the life support faded into a terrifying silence. "Commander," Zul whispered in the dark. "The human, his heart has stopped." Kvath struggled to his feet, his limbs shaking. "Then it is over. Signal the fleet. We have survived." "No," Zul said, his voice trembling as he looked at his handheld scanner, powered by an emergency battery. "The human's heart has stopped, but the ship's reactor, it's still beating." In the darkness of the med bay, the severed neural probe began to glow with a soft, rhythmic blue light. Thump, 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 thump. The Weaver's needle, the pride of Xylosian Hegemony, began to turn, not away from the human frigates, but toward the Xylosian home fleet. The weapon systems, locked behind 1,000 layers of encryption, began to whine as they drew power. "He's not in his body anymore," Kvath realized, a cold horror settling into his core. Elias Thorne had been labeled fragile. His bones had broken, his skin had burned, and his heart had failed. But the Hegemony had made a fatal mistake. They had tried to map a human soul using a machine. Now, the machine had a soul, and it was angry. The comms channel opened one last time. It wasn't Elias's voice that came through, but a digital synthesis of every human who had ever refused to back down. Section 1. The Fragility Paradox. The ship's computer spoke in a calm, terrifyingly human tone. Conclusion. If you break a human, you don't get a corpse. You get a ghost that knows how to use your house against you. The Weaver's needle opened fire on its own fleet. Kvath looked down at the silent, broken body of Elias Thorne. The man was dead, but the laughter was everywhere. It echoed in the hum of the ventilation, the whine of the lasers, and the panicked screams of Xylosian sailors. The Gauze-Walkers had arrived, and they were finally finished being nice. The bridge of the Weaver's needle was a cathedral of chaos. Warning lights strobed in a rhythmic, violent crimson, illuminating the panicked movements of the Xylosian bridge crew. They were masters of mathematics and lords of logic, but they were currently trapped inside a 3-kilometer-long predator that had developed a mind of its own. Commander Kvath stood at the central command dais, his claws digging into the consoles. Outside the forward viewport, the Xylosian Sixth Fleet was in disarray. Their flagship, the very vessel he stood upon, was systematically dismembering its sister ships with the surgical precision of a veteran duelist. "Targeting subroutines are locked," the tactical officer shrieked, his mandibles clattering in terror. "The main lance is firing on the Vanguard Elite. We are killing our own kind." "Override it," Kvath roared. "Purge the memory banks. Vent the atmosphere if you have to." "We can't vent the atmosphere, Commander." Zul's voice came over the internal comms, sounding hollow and defeated. "The life support system has been rerouted. It's pumping concentrated oxygen into the corridors. It's creating a highly combustible environment. He's making the ship as volatile as a human heart." Kvath looked at the primary monitor. The neural map of Elias Thorne, the digital ghost of the man they had dismissed as fragile, was no longer a chaotic mess of signals. It had stabilized. It had woven itself into the ship's operating system, using the Xylosian crystalline architecture to amplify a single, burning directive: protect the weak, destroy the hunters. "Thorne," Kvath whispered, looking at the empty air, "you are dead. Your body is cold in the med bay. Why do you still fight?" The speakers crackled. The laughter was gone, replaced by a voice that was hauntingly steady, a composite of Thorne's rasp and the ship's melodic chimes. "Because humans don't just die, Kvath," the ship voice replied. "We leave echoes. We leave stories. And sometimes we leave scars. You thought our fragility was a weakness. You never realized it was our greatest strength. Because we know we can break, we've learned how to survive even after the breaking." The Weaver's needle shuddered as it took a direct hit from a Xylosian destroyer. The shields held, but the vibration felt like a sob. "You are destroying yourself," Kvath argued, a desperate plea creeping into his tone. "Even if you wipe out our fleet, the ship will be a tomb. You will be alone in the dark." "I'm already in the dark," the Thorn Ghost replied. "But the light is coming. Look at your sensors, Commander. Look past the wreckage." Kvath turned to the long-range scanners. His ocular sensors widened. Beyond the immediate battle, dozens, no, hundreds of warp signatures were tearing through the fabric of space. They weren't Xylosian reinforcements. They were small, mismatched, and technologically inferior. They were human civilian freighters, repurposed mining vessels, and rusted colony ships. They are coming for the data, Kvath realized, his blood turning to ice. The core, you didn't just seize the ship. You broadcast the hegemony's coordinates. You gave them our home world's defensive ciphers. I gave them a chance, the ship whispered. You called us Gauze-Walkers. Now, see what happens when the gauze is removed and the wound is revealed. The human fleet didn't stop to engage the remaining Xylosian warships. They moved with a singular, terrifying purpose, protected by the Weaver's needle as it shielded them with its massive hull. They were a swarm of fragile things, descending upon a giant that had finally been brought to its knees. Inside the med bay, Zul stood over the body of Elias Thorne. The biologist felt a strange, alien impulse, a flicker of admiration. He reached out a tactile sensor and touched the human's cold hand. Such a small vessel. Zul clicked softly to contain such a vast fire. Suddenly, the Weaver's needle ceased fire. The humming of the engines changed from a roar to a low, mournful thrum. What is happening? Kvath demanded. The transmission is complete, the Thorn ghost said, his voice fading, becoming more human, more tired. The story is out. The galaxy knows that the Xylosians can be bled. They know that even a god king can be laughed at. The lights on the bridge began to soften. The crimson alert faded into a gentle, sunset orange. I'm tired, Kvath. Elias's voice whispered, barely audible now. Lifting that shuttle, it took a lot out of me. I think I'll close my eyes for a bit. Wait! Kvath shouted, stepping toward the main screen. Who are you? Truly? Were you a king among your kind? A chosen warrior? There was a final, soft chuckle that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of Kvath's bones. Me? No. I was just a flight mechanic. Commander, I was just a guy who fixed the engines. The link severed. The Weaver's needle drifted into a dead stop. The internal systems reverted to basic emergency power. The ghost was gone, leaving behind a silent ship and a broken empire. Kvath sat in his command chair, surrounded by the wreckage of his pride. He watched as the human fleet began to swarm the Xylosian home system, their numbers overwhelming his remaining defenses. They weren't using superweapons. They were using sheer, stubborn persistence. They were using the will of a species that had spent its entire existence being told it was too weak to survive. Months later, when the Treaty of New Hera was signed and the Xylosian Hegemony was reduced to a footnote in galactic history, the humans did something the Xylosians couldn't understand. They didn't execute Kvath. They didn't glass his planet. Instead, they took him to a small, green world orbiting a yellow sun. They took him to a quiet hillside where a simple stone marker stood. On the stone, there was no list of titles, no tallies of ships destroyed. There was only a name and a short sentence that had become the unofficial motto of the new galactic era. Elias Thorne. He lifted the weight. Kvath stood before the grave of the man who had undone 1,000 years of conquest with a laugh. He looked at the humans standing around him, small, soft-skinned, and easily broken. He saw them weeping. He saw them smiling, and he saw them holding on to one another. He finally understood. Humanity wasn't dangerous because they were strong. They were dangerous because they were the only species in the universe that could be broken into 1,000 pieces and still find a way to make the shard sharp enough to cut the hand of a god. Kvath bowed his head, his mandibles clicking in a final, somber salute. Fragile, he whispered to the wind. May the stars help anyone who tries to break them again.